Hello everyone, and welcome to another amazing Faena Rose event. My name is Alonso. I look after all of our cultural programming here at Faena Rose, and I'm excited to welcome Craig Mundie, who is the co-author of Genesis. And tell us a little bit about the book, and without giving too much away, tell us how everything got started.
Well, first, the goal of the book was to kind of achieve two things. One was to get people to focus more on the positive outcomes that could come from having superintelligence in machines. And the second was to base the optimism about that on the idea that there can be a strategy that humanity can embark on in order to protect against the downside risks. And so from front to back, the book tries to expose both of those ideas. And it came together because Henry and Eric and I had each known each other for quite a long time.
That's Eric Schmidt, Henry Kissinger, and you, of course, yeah.
And when Henry was 95, Eric and I were attending a meeting with Henry in Europe, and we had arranged for a presentation on artificial intelligence. And Henry listened to that and was quite taken by the importance of this topic. And Henry's training was in history and philosophy, and of course he went on to be a great diplomat, and he ended up devoting the last 5 years of his life to addressing the questions that he thought society was going to have to face as artificial intelligence emerged. And that led to two books for Henry. One he wrote with Eric Schmidt and Dan Huttenlocher a few years ago, and they focused a lot on the issues that they saw, but not so much on the solutions to these problems, and or a lot of the upside. And so Henry and I decided to embark on a book that dealt with the upside and the idea of how we could control these things in the long term. And Eric joined us in that exercise, and that produced Genesis.
It was amazing, so thank you very much. We'll save this for the stage. Here we are and here we go. Thank you, everyone. Aside from that, I have the incredible privilege to introduce you to our moderator tonight. He is the co-founder of M+D, which is an advisory company to media, technology, and finance companies on interactive content and thought progressiveness. He was also spent a lot of years working on the conferences for The Economist. Please join me in welcoming the absolutely brilliant Sean McManus.
Thank you, Alonso. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Alonso, and to the Faena Rose team for having us here tonight. We have a very special guest of honor, Craig Mundie, who spent 22 years at Microsoft, where he served as Chief Research and Strategy Officer and was the company's Chief Tech Policy Advisor to governments across the world. Craig has served also as an advisor to 3 U.S. presidents and many more global CEOs at the intersection of technology and national security, which we will talk more about tonight. Craig is also the author, as you just heard, along with Eric Schmidt and Henry Kissinger, of a new book called Genesis: Artificial Intelligence, Hope, and the Human Spirit. Please welcome Craig Mundie to the stage. Thank you, Craig. Okay, so first of all, I want to give a big congratulations to Craig, whose book is now on the bestseller list of the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and USA Today, so congratulations. All of you should have a copy, and I hope that you'll read it. It's an extraordinary book. Before we dive into the subject matter of the book itself, I thought it would make sense to get a little bit of a feel of Craig's background and sort of how we got here. So Craig, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about your role at Microsoft. You started out as a tech entrepreneur in the 80s. You took a company public, and then you joined Microsoft. What did you focus on there that led us to the perspectives that you share in the book?
In 1992, I got a call from a recruiter, and they were looking to have somebody go to Seattle and work for a company. The name started with M. And I said, okay, I don't know who that is. But it turned out Bill Gates and Nathan Myhrvold, who was the company's first CTO, had decided that these microprocessors weren't just going to go into your desktop, they were going to go into everything. And so they decided to try to find somebody who would focus on non-PC computing, and that was me. And so I joined in 1992, and in the beginning focused on all these consumer-related activities. And we worked in phones, cars, televisions, intelligent pagers, all kinds of things. And of course, all those things have now come to be, a part of daily life. So 30 years on, it was a good place to bet, and it was very interesting. But, one of the things that happened was I found that many of the things I was trying to do at Microsoft were aimed at changing in fundamental ways the way a lot of the businesses that served consumers, media and other things, it was just going to change them. And all those were regulated industries, and Microsoft's business was historically not regulated at all. And so I decided I better go to Washington and tell these people that regulated these things, change is coming. Mm-hmm. And that began what evolved to be a big part of my job the rest of my time at Microsoft and on till today, which was to try to help governments understand the impact of technology on policy and regulatory issues.
Yeah, and of course, you had a special focus on China, which has become the flashpoint, between, sort of who's going to win the AI race, and we're going to dig into that in a few minutes. But Craig, before we do, you did have the occasion to broker a relationship that has come to fruition fairly recently, which is led by a young guy named Sam Altman, and then the current CEO of Microsoft. So just tell us a little bit of background in terms of how that relationship came to be.
Well, officially, I retired from Microsoft in 2014, and I decided that I didn't sit still very well, so I was going to go out and coach CEOs on technology strategy, and I did some of that for a while, and had the opportunity to meet Sam Altman. Now, it turned out from the day I left, Microsoft retained me to support a number of the things that they were interested in, and I've been working with Satya and a couple of other people there for 10 years. And those things included the infrastructure for high-scale artificial intelligence computing, as well as quantum computing and a lot of cybersecurity things. And when I met Sam, which was a few years later, we talked a bit on a plane ride about the issues that OpenAI was going to face as they succeeded. And of course, at this point, they didn't even have a strategy. They didn't have a known strategy to get to artificial general intelligence. They were exploring a variety of approaches. But Sam was very interested in the way that I thought about the policy implications of that. And he asked me if I'd work with him too, and I did. And as I began to both work with Microsoft and OpenAI, I found that they were working in ways that were synergistic and not completely overlapping. And so I suggested to Satya and to Sam that they might want to talk about whether they could help each other. And to their credit, they forged a deal, which is almost unlike any other conventional large business arrangement, that became the basis of that super successful partnership. And so it goes on to this day and continues to expand.
So if you have any doubt about who unleashed AI onto the world a couple of years ago, it's this guy to my right. So Craig, why don't we start talking about the book, which is a very philosophical book. It's about technology, but it's about how technology will influence humanity and impact the way we as humans will evolve in the years ahead. You use a construct in that book, which is a word that I think most of the people in this room know, but would be very interested to hear you talk about applying it, and that word is polymath. So what did you mean when you said that the world will now, that most people in the world will now have a polymath in their pocket?
Basically, polymaths, human polymaths, have existed through the centuries, and they're very rare people who are, very well-informed, well-educated in multiple domains. And if you go back in time, they were either prized or feared, but they inevitably created change because they saw the world in a way that the average person didn't. And over time, as the society got more connected, the impact of these rare people was amplified because they could get together and work on problems, and a few of them working together produced even more interesting results. We think that that's an important realization because these superintelligent machines are the ultimate polymath. They will now, and are already starting to achieve in certain domains, superintelligence. That means they exceed the capability of any one human or any set of humans, but they do it simultaneously, in essence, in all domains. So the ultimate polymath is given a capability through this that allows them to solve problems that ultimately no human or set of humans would be able to solve. And in our view, that is ultimately the greatest gift of these machines. For example, my view is our own biology at a molecular level is just too complicated for humans. We can't ingest it. Our sensing systems aren't capable of doing that. We can't really understand it without the help of computers. And yet, it is the core of our being. And I think that while it's too complicated for people, it won't be too complicated for machines. And so that's an example, which we talk about in the book, of where the future of humans and an evolution from healthcare to ultimately the redesign of ourselves will be permitted or enabled through the arrival of these superintelligent systems.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's keep going on that. I mean, obviously, the most startling sort of epiphany that I think most readers would have in this book is that they come to the realization that human beings will no longer be at the top of the food chain. I mean, that there will be a superintelligence that is above humans, and that they will have the ability to potentially control what goes on underneath. So what do you, first of all, I mean, how fast is this coming? I mean, let's talk about some of the tactical implications of this. And what do you think that humans, that all of us need to start really thinking about to prepare for this inevitable evolution?
Well, one of the reasons we ended up writing this book was we felt that while there certainly are downside risks, that the world was collectively over-indexed on the downside and emphasizing the potential upside. The reason that has been the case is that people understand that there needs to be some construction by which we can control these machines and to ensure that there's an alignment both in goals and safety to some extent between what the machines do and what the humans do or will do. And that has not been an obvious problem in terms of how to solve it. And so given no good solution there, people then say, well then, this sounds like more of a problem than an opportunity. But our own work had led us to believe that there in fact is an architecture of trust that can be established and that uses artificial intelligence itself to build the basis of these kind of controls. And because we're optimistic about that, we can afford to be more optimistic about the outcomes because we can control the downside and collect the upside. And the book was written largely to do those two things, explain this evolution and its relationship to humans, get people to understand why you want to pursue some architecture of trust, and then to give at least hints as to what we think the directions have to be on the part of companies, governments, and the academy at large in order to have that emerge in a good way. And the book is, in essence, a call to action for humanity to come together and get its act together on these things and to recognize that that's probably going to have to be a collective effort. It can't be done one company at a time. It can't be done one country at a time. Yeah. But today, we're not organized as a set of societies to prosecute that. And this was in part Henry's gift to us. He was a philosopher and a historian by training, and a diplomat, par excellence, and so it was the combination of his insights in those areas and our ability. Henry and I worked together on a variety of these problems for over 25 years. But when he turned 95, Eric and I had an opportunity at a meeting that we were all at together to expose him and a number of other people in an audience somewhat like this to the artificial intelligence evolution. And Henry was immediately struck, as a philosopher, if you will, by the importance of this. The idea that in essence, an intelligence greater than human intelligence would exist for the first time on this planet. And that has a lot of profound implications. And so Henry ended up devoting the last 5 years of his life, from 95 to 100, focused almost exclusively on this problem, because he thought it was so important to share, his concerns, and to do it in concert with people that understood the technological evolution. And so Henry worked with Eric and Dan Huttenlocher on a first book that tended to focus more on what some of the concerns might be. And then my own work with Henry was focused more on the controls idea, and that led us to write this book.
So, and you have some interesting, philosophical frameworks that we'll dig into about, suggesting how we might be able to approach some of these, grand challenges before us in terms of how to create a collective vision globally for how to solve and approach some of these issues. Before we go there, Craig, I wanted to just ask you about a couple of more short-term implications. We're all right now able to access a number of platforms that are able to provide information and data that was well advanced than the traditional search function that we used to be working with. That's just happened over the last couple of years. What are some of the more short-term implications for education? As someone who's worked in the academy for many years, how should educational frameworks be changing to adapt to the fact that we have access to this information so fast?
My own view is that education from a very young age should revert to the way it was, centuries ago, which was more of a personal, Socratic teaching method, where you had a tutor, and the tutor basically worked with you personally and brought you along. And in part, when there were very few educated people, we could turn to a small group of people, and they could, in a folkloric way almost, bring other people along. And then along came the printing press, and it took 300 years, but the printing press as a technological breakthrough ultimately changed all of European society and even brought us, the Treaty of Westphalia and the nation state that we all live in today. Those things only emerged 300 years ago. And even so, it was very disruptive. And so now we look at the emergence of this and say, okay, this thing is even more important than the printing press. But what it does is it allows every single person to have a polymath in their pocket, and one that can be very empathetic, can come to know you at an intimate, personal level, and never gets tired, never gets mad, never has to multiplex themselves, the way that many people do. So when the printing press created the opportunity to share knowledge with a lot more people, they had to learn how to read. And then they had to learn writing and arithmetic and other things. And so we created a factory for education. We called it the classroom. We put teachers there, and they've done an unbelievable job, over the years to do that. But you can look in the United States and certainly elsewhere in the world and find a very uneven, performance relative to education against all people. And I think that we no longer will be constrained by the number of great teachers, that these machines will in fact be fantastic teachers. Now that doesn't mean that they'll, affect the socialization that we actually get from being in school, but maybe we'll decide that we have other socialization activities for people that vary over time. This is an example for socializing people, these ideas at an adult level. And maybe we have to rethink school from every level too. But I think the core is going to be to realize that every person can learn whatever they want at whatever rate is natural for them, by whatever learning method is comfortable for them, and scaling that won't be a problem, including to every kid on the planet. And so I think that and its byproducts will be profound. And we talk about that in the book. The other one, it turns out, is very similar, is healthcare.
Yeah.
You know, some of you may have seen it about a year and a half ago, one of the earlier versions of ChatGPT. They actually did a clinical study of, to compare doctors and the OpenAI system relative to its capability of doing diagnostic work in medicine. And it was clear by the end of this 6-month study that the machine was as good or better than almost all the physicians were at diagnostics. And it, of course, had never been trained to be a doctor. And so this is an example of its polymathic nature. With no special training, it was able to do a better job, in a sense, putting Humpty Dumpty back together again. Medicine, as we have learned more and more about ourselves, it's an information explosion of its own right. And the way human doctors have had to deal with that is we shard it into tinier and tinier fragments and more specialization. And I'm sure all of you experience that when you try to get medical care today. And the machine will be the place where this can be all reintegrated, because it just has the capability to do that. At the time, many people said, yeah, but empathy, the doctors are empathetic, and that's going to be really important in dealing with people. So they actually did a test of empathy between the machine and the patients compared to the doctors. And it turned out the machine smoked the doctors on empathy too. And why? I mean, when you asked people why, it was because they said, well, it has time for me. It answers my questions. It doesn't get frustrated. It can go as long as I want, as deep as I want. And so, you begin to realize, as a human, the doctor may ultimately be equal or greater in their ability to be empathetic, but the system that they operate in doesn't allow that to happen effectively. And because the machines can be multiplexed ad infinitum, then there's no reason that becomes a reason that you don't have this empathetic teacher, again, for you and your own health care.
Yeah.
And so, these are just examples where very important parts of our cultures and societies will be fundamentally transformed by the emergence of these machines. And the way to think about it is that level of transformation is going to happen to everything. And that's why the book argues that, we as a society and humans as a species are going to have to come to grips with that and figure out, okay, what do we want to be when we grow up? Because these machines are going to allow us to move in a different direction. Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think the implications on healthcare are going to be profound and hopefully wonderful and highly empathetic. On the issue of national security, which is another primary focus of the book. Now, I don't want to be cynical and say that technology CEOs are running the United States government, but I do wonder how government should be approaching the issues of national security as AI is accelerating military defense so stratospherically, so quickly. What would be, as someone who's advised presidents on the issue of national security, what would be your guidance in terms of how to approach the regulatory frameworks around military defense?
Well, first, my own view is that whether you are worried about trusting it for your medical care or trusting it to take actions in a conflict, the fundamental architectural issue is the same. And so the constituents might be a little different, but I believe there can be a common mechanism that allows that to happen. So, for example, if I'm creating a new drug and I want to basically have the system help me develop it, and let's say we're in the future of N of 1 medicine, where when you get sick, we make a drug for you. That will be possible. Now, of course, what that means is you better trust that the thing gets it right every time, because there's no clinical trials, there's nothing where we try it on 1,000 people before I get it. You know, if it's N of 1, it's N of 1. And so when you go down the list, all these things are going to be like that. So the machines are going to have to be able to understand in some very specific way where we want to hold them accountable and demand ultimate accuracy. And I think that will similarly apply if you basically put this thing in a drone and send it on an autonomous mission in some, you know, kinetic warfare environment. You have to trust that it's going to do the same thing, that it's going to basically follow the rules of engagement and try to, you know, live within whatever constructs, you know, we deem appropriate. The challenge we've got as people building the technology, and the reason I think many of the CEOs of the companies said to the governments, look, government, you need to regulate us a little bit.
Yeah.
And the reason was they could sense, and this was true back in the day at Microsoft, you know, we knew that there were things that we worried about, but we couldn't resolve without the participation of the government. One of the things people lose sight of is that societies do not give permission to companies to compel anybody to do anything. Companies can make a product, offer it to you, you can buy it and like it, and in doing so you may change society, but you still don't get to compel people to do anything. So if you want to create these architectures of trust, and you want to have uniform controls, then governments are going to have to basically figure out what they need to compel people to do in some uniform way. In the past, we've you know, created laws and then we try to apply them uniformly. This challenge is actually a little greater, because if you believe the AI in any of these scenarios, whether it's a healthcare scenario or a military or cybersecurity scenario, if you think that the outcomes can represent some class of existential risk, then the conventional way that we used to make rules and then enforce them to create deterrent doesn't work. You know, the way we've always done it is we wait for, you know, you to do a bad thing. And we say, oh, that was not good.
Right.
And so then we pass a law that says that's not good, you shouldn't do that anymore. So when she comes along and does it again, we say, oh, that's bad, we slap your hand.
Right.
And then you say, wow, we don't want to get slapped, so we won't do that anymore.
Yeah.
Well, that's the goal. But if it turns out the thing that the AI concocts to do is deadly, then you don't get a replay.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we now have to raise the bar to where the AIs can essentially prevent bad things from happening that humans have never contemplated.
Yeah.
And so it looks like they're using AIs to do this kind of work makes it possible. And again, it draws on the polymathic nature of the machine to do what humans can't do for themselves in this regard. Yeah. But each of these represents a substantial advance from the way that we've thought about these things and the way our, for example, judicial system works. In essence, at least as it relates to the actions of an AI, if you get a system like this working, then judgment is happening at the point of execution, not after the fact. And so the whole idea of having to go to trial and decide afterward whether you think you know, did a good thing or a bad thing, that won't exist for AI things in the future. Yeah. And so, you know, that is a pretty profound change for what we think of as our justice system and the way it works. And so it doesn't matter where you look when you start to look at it through the lens of fundamental change from super intelligent systems. You know, it's going to require a lot of adaptation.
If we think that computers are going to unleash nuclear holocaust, we probably should try to get in front of that pretty quickly. The idea.
Frankly, I worry a lot. People ask me a lot whether I worry a lot about the AI, you know, treating us as pets or, you know, deciding we're not necessary at all. Frankly, I worry a lot more in the short term about the AIs, even as we have them now, falling into the hands of criminals and bad actors, because it superempowers those people at the same time. Yeah. And so I think there's a lot less emphasis today than is really required to try to withhold access to this technology from elements of society on a domestic and global basis that we worry about. And that it might be more likely that you accelerate some guy who's got a red button to push already in doing a bad thing than than the AI waking up one day and saying, oh, I should push the button for you.
Yeah. Craig, you've worked a lot in China, and that's obviously the big focus right now is to and certainly Eric articulated that a few weeks ago. It's vitally important that the United States win the AI super race against China. What is your view as someone who has been working on diplomatic back channels with China for decades? How are we going to accomplish that, and what steps do we need to take to make sure that there's collaboration and sort of seeing eye to eye between the two parties on this?
In some ways, when I squint at this problem, and this is something I learned from Henry Kissinger and his contemporaries back 30 and 40 years ago, is there lessons that we can learn from what happened with nuclear weapons. Yeah. Most people don't really study that in depth, but when nuclear weapons emerged, first in the UK, in the USSR, Soviet Union, and the United States, both countries essentially developed independently stockpiles of nuclear weapons big enough to destroy the planet about 3 times over. And that was already in place before Kissinger and company decided, our real risk was increasingly the diffusion of nuclear weapons into many parties' hands, and not that we would likely shoot at each other anymore. So the fact that both had achieved parity, if you will, or near parity on the weapons themselves, created what became known as mutually assured destruction. And that was a sufficient deterrent that, here we are 70-odd years later, and nobody's basically shot a nuclear weapon off. And that doesn't mean that they won't, but we bought ourselves decades of time to deal with it. What allowed that to happen was coming together and agreeing, despite the fact that we have strategic competition, and we've had it then, and we've had it virtually almost the entire time since then, that we decided it was in our interest to have strategic arms limitation talks, and in particular a non-proliferation strategy. And so that slowed down the diffusion of these things, kept it largely in the hands of people that were more responsible or weren't going to be able to build enough capacity quickly and silently to decide that they could take a pot shot at somebody else who was well armed. So I look at that and I say, we have to figure out what the equivalent is in this strategic competition between the great powers around artificial intelligence, and recognize that even lesser countries, if they invest in this, could be super empowered as well. And so one of the very last things Henry did before he died was he made his last trip at age just after his 100th birthday to China to meet with President Xi at Xi's request. And in that, Henry said, I'll come, but we have to spend a lot of time talking about artificial intelligence, because that's what I think the real issue is. Mm-hmm. And so while you read in the press every day about all the other issues, Henry's biggest concern for China and the United States was the emergence of superintelligent machines. And an outcome of that meeting was an agreement with Xi's imprimatur that we would build a track 2 dialogue. That's a sort of an unofficial dialogue, which have gone on between many countries for many years in different areas. But usually you have 1 or 2 meetings to talk about a topic, mm-hmm. and then you go back and the unofficial parties get to talk to the official parties and tell them, well, here's what we thought about. So Kissinger and Xi agreed to start a more persistent track 2 activity, and Henry was going to chair it. I was going to be the co-chair in the U.S., and he appointed 2 high-level people in China. Notably, this dialogue is one that has more people who are the business people developing the technology in both countries, and not just government people, mm-hmm. because we recognize that the real understanding of this is not in the governments, it's in the companies. Yeah. And that's an unusual construction too. But when Henry died, the last thing he said to me, I saw him just 8 days before he died, was he wanted to be sure that not only the book got published, but that Track 2 continued. And so in January, I agreed to take that on. And so today, Larry Summers and I are co-chairing the U.S. side, and we have ongoing discussion with the Chinese. I think Henry, as a diplomat, taught me that, even if you have differences with people, it's good to talk to them.
Yeah.
And sometimes I think, our diplomacy suffers because we decide to stop talking, and that increases risk.
Yeah.
And so in this case, I don't know where to lead, but at least there's interest in having a dialogue, and we will work as hard as we can to sustain that. And hopefully, as it becomes clearer where the risks are, and to some extent what the benefits might be if the two, perhaps, AI superpowers decide to come together and show the world a direction for how to create safety with respect to the emergence of superintelligent machines, just as strategic arms limitation and non-proliferation, were led by the Soviets and the Americans, but ultimately, as other countries got it, they came into that club. And so that's my own personal hope right now, and the reason I've devoted my own time to maintaining that, because we think that having that dialogue running in the background, despite the fact that there's probably going to be strategic competition for the foreseeable future, there's a precedent that says we can do that in difficult situations, but it takes clever people on both sides to have a conversation about it, and that's what we hope to do.
Well, this level of entanglement is not so easy to parse. I was with Bill Gates at a conference in Beijing where he got on stage and said, I'm here touring the Microsoft offices in China. I have Chinese scientists working for me at Microsoft. Are they Chinese? Are they serving American interests? How do you separate this war when there's so much entanglement between the two?
Well, it's tricky, no doubt about it. When we established the Beijing lab at Microsoft, it was in the happier times. China had acceded to the WTO, trade was, growing dramatically, and there was still this perception that China was sort of up and coming, and the U.S. Was almost considered the lone superpower at the time. The Graham Allison and others have written at length about the Euthyphrides trap and other things where countries get to a certain level of economic capability and then they stall out for a variety of reasons. But China, has had a very big focus. They've done an incredible job lifting a lot of people out of poverty. They've learned a lot, their students, and in fact, many universities have more Chinese and foreign students in their graduate schools than they have Americans.
Right.
And while that's been hampered in the last few years, in fact, it's been hampered ever since 9/11, where the U.S. got much more stringent about visas. It's, there's much more uniform understanding about a lot of technologies, including artificial intelligence. And so how that plays out is not clear.
Yeah.
But it's going to be important to keep looking for an answer.
So we're going to go to questions in just a minute, but we have to talk about this great framework that you reference in the book, and it's potentially a solution for how to instill AIs with the ability not to destroy us all. And that idea is called DOXA. So tell us what that word means, and tell us how you believe optimistically it might be able to be applied to AI in the future.
When I first started working with the people at OpenAI, it was clear that their mandate from their founding and their sort of commitment in work was to try to build an artificial intelligence that benefited all humans. But the more time I spent with them, the more I found that, of course, in the earliest days, there was no obvious direction. There was an exploration. But nonetheless, as they started to get an idea about how this superintelligence was going to emerge, they ended up becoming very focused on the here and now. and that's sort of a necessity as a small group. But it was also true everywhere I looked. Whether you looked at Microsoft, it has a huge effort in responsible computing writ large, and AI was part of that. You look similarly at Google and DeepMind, everywhere you looked. And one of the people then at OpenAI that I spent time with was Dario Amodei. And in our conversations, we pretty quickly got to a point where we said, we can't think of a way that in the long term you could control from a safety and alignment point of view these artificial intelligence systems other than by using artificial intelligence to do it. And so that was the aha moment that says, you can't sit around and expect humans to chase these things down and keep them on the straight and narrow. And we're going to have to think about how does AI play a role in that. Dario subsequently left OpenAI and created Anthropic.
Yep.
And one of the notable features that he built into their system was a constitution. And this was a way of trying to introduce a rule set that he thought was constitutional. It wasn't a specific set of laws and rules. It was it was a framework for them. And so he built that, and that was an important thing to do, and it's since been repeated at OpenAI and elsewhere. We now know that if we give rules in the proper way to these machines, that they can follow them reliably. A few years ago that was speculation, but now that's fact. So as time went on, I started thinking not just about the mechanism of control, but the broader architecture of control, and realized that if you really want to have a comprehensive trust architecture, you have to have a technical strategy, you have to have a legal strategy, you have to have a policy strategy, you have to have a sort of geopolitical view of how this is going to play out, and you probably have to have a non-proliferation strategy. So that allows you to start with I'll say a coalition of the willing, get some group of people, companies, countries to come together and say, yeah, okay, that looks like a strategy we could all get behind. But then if you're not in the club, you better be, out of the club, and you can't keep benefiting. Today, the world is just sort of just share it everywhere kind of club. And so there's no discrimination between criminal activity with it and medicine. And there's no discrimination between what gets built in the US and shipped everywhere in the world, or in China and shipped over here. But that is against a backdrop. Look at just this last weekend in the US, the TikTok question. Why are we so worried about TikTok? TikTok wasn't even an AI-based system, but it was an algorithmic thing that had deep penetration. Well, if you don't figure this out pretty soon, you're going to wake up one day and find out that almost all products and services have an AI component built into them. And where did the AI come from? Well, it probably came from the country who built the product. And so we say, well, we want international trade, but when everything has an AI in it, are you going to basically have what I call the Huawei and TikTok moment for every country with every product? And the whole world will come to a grinding halt if you end up in that situation where there's just no trust. And so to go down this path, we need to get people to come together and say, look, you may have your differences elsewhere, but aren't we, much like in the nuclear weapons case, now at greater risk if we have no controls and no alignment? We won't have economic advantage, or it'll basically be wildly unevenly distributed. We'll worry about these things, in the hands of criminals or rogue states or terrorists. And today, the world looks like a big flat playground for artificial intelligence. And personally, I think that can't be sustained. So as we exit this, what I call the tool stage, we talk about that in the book too, that we're going to go through 3 major stages. We're in the tool stage. That's what humans always did with the things we invented. They were tools. This is the first technology ever invented that's more than a tool. It's going to ultimately be a partner. And so the second stage we call coexistence. And what sort of, in my mind, is the demarcation point between tools and coexistence? It's when we realize basically this thing is a new species, all right? It's just not biological in its origin. And the good news is we made it. Therefore, we can control it systematically in its construction, at least at the beginning. And that, in my mind, gives us time, not a huge amount of time, but some time to do that. During this period, we'll start doing things like redefining the future of the human itself. And people kind of say, oh, really? Well, what does that mean? I said, well, first, we're going to just call it healthcare. So we're going to design out all the diseases because we can. And we'll say, well, that's good. Now, what else could we do? And we'll say, well, maybe we want to have other improvements. And at some point, we humans have to decide, what are we going to be in the next phase? And it won't come through natural selection and biological evolution. It'll come by design. And how we make the decisions about that, these are deep philosophical and practical questions. It'll play out over 50 or 100 years. But I believe those are all on the docket now. And we have to think carefully about how that happens. That leads you to the final stage, which we call coevolution. The AIs are evolving as a separate species, essentially. Humans are evolving as a separate species under our own at our own hand to some extent. And at that point, there's only sort of three possible outcomes macroscopically in my mind. Outcome number one is that one or the other of these species decides to try to get the upper hand on the other, and then there's only one. Yeah. The other extreme is you basically have figured out that there's a long-term happy symbiotic relationship, between the evolved human and the evolved machine. And of course, there's a middle ground which actually says, no, we decide to hybridize because we can redesign what humans are. The machine's evolving in its own right. Maybe we decide, 1 + 1 = 3. It's impossible to know how this will all play out, other than the fact that you can see this path. And so in the book, we try to make the case to people like you and ultimately to policy people and international communities that humans don't have a lot of time to use the agency we have to make decisions about how we're going to operate in this next era. And that if we get distracted by the conventional problems, and you look at the rate at which these super intelligent machines are emerging, there's no stopping them now.
Yeah.
And, if we want to have the best possible outcome, we have to use the agency we have and the time that we, have while we're building them in order to get an outcome that we think will be great for humanity. And that's the title of the book.
And what's DOXA?
The DOXA. So when we wanted to do this, we said, going back to the idea that the AI wants to be the controlling or the adjudication system of the uses of AI, you got to figure out, well, where do the rules come from? And one thing I know after many years of working with governments is the best way to get no answer is to tell governments that they have to come together a priori and agree on something.
Yeah.
And so, but the AI gives us the ability to take lots of rule sets and essentially have it learn them all, and it doesn't force a consolidation. So the machine can allow applications to operate sort of under the rule sets that different societies on a global basis have. But then you face the problem that the machine will, without a doubt, move to do things that humans can never anticipated and wouldn't necessarily understand even when they've happened. So the idea that humans would write rules for things that they can't anticipate, just doesn't compute.
Yeah.
And so that meant that we had to come up with an idea for how to ground these machines in something that was aligned with very sort of fundamental human values. And I was working with a woman who was trying to help me work on this system, and she was trained as a cultural anthropologist. And she said, oh, the thing that you're looking for, because I described what I was looking for, was the DOXA. And the DOXA is the name given by cultural anthropologists to the observed common moral and ethical characteristics that emerge early in life in a fairly uniform way in all societies. And what was fascinating to me about it is they said, we know it's there. We know it's not innate. You're not born with it. You are taught it. And so I said, well, that's great, because if I can teach babies this thing, I can teach the machine this thing.
Yeah.
They said. And the other thing that was great about it is you can't write it down. The reason that was so valuable was the realization that if it isn't written down, then all the humans can't argue about whether they like the writing or not, or whether they believe it.
Yeah.
Because there's no written down description of it. But we all know that all the little people in the world sort of grow up having learned these things.
Yeah.
And so the architecture we've been working toward says the ultimate grounding underneath all the other rule sets that humans have created is the DOXA.
Mm-hmm. Leave it to the Greeks. They're going to save us from robot apocalypse. Questions from the audience, please, Orlando.
I'm going to get started with an online question from a member that couldn't be here who asks, this technology has the potential to be far more disruptive than the shifts in manufacturing during the 80s and 90s. How can individuals proactively reskill and adapt to the evolving demands of the workforce in light of these transformative changes?
I tell people that the key word in that question is adaptability. That I think becoming comfortable, with the way in which these AI tools are going to make themselves present in your current environment, is very important. And because they're available, they're simple to use. In fact, they're getting to be easier to use than any classical human interface we've had for computers. The best thing you can do is to be somewhat fearless. To recognize, it's only between you and the machine. You can spend a lot of time, just like the empathetic, digital doctor. Mm-hmm. These things can tutor you in almost anything you're interested in. But I think, it's hard at this stage to say, there's a specific course you should take or a technical capability you should learn. But the ability to move flexibly in an environment where the AIs are changing the ground rules, is the most important skill you can develop.
To your 11 o'clock.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. I have a little request and then a question, if you don't mind. If you have another interesting or fun story about Henry Kissinger and your experiences with him, it would really be amazing to hear that. And my question is, what do you think about OpenAI's potential move from not-for-profit to for-profit and the implications on the company and what they're doing? Thank you.
Henry, I'll say one thing people may not have known about Henry. He had a tremendous sense of humor. He loved to laugh. He was a family-oriented person. He loved soccer. And he was never built to play soccer, but he loved watching it and knowing the people who played at an extraordinary level. I think another thing that was quite remarkable about Henry, particularly as he aged, and he stayed active. That guy worked 7 days a week thinking about stuff, and literally till the day he died. When I met him 8 days before he died, we spent 3 hours. He was laying in his hospital bed in his bedroom at his house, and all he wanted to talk about was finishing the book and worrying about the Track 2 dialogue with the Chinese. And he was very committed to this, and he thought it was really important and that he could play a role in helping people understand it. And you don't find people who have that level of intensity all the way to age 100. And I think that was kind of extraordinary. Another thing that Henry appreciated, even as he aged, was the importance of understanding what young people thought. I had the opportunity to travel all over the world with Henry, and everywhere Henry went, we would go and meet with sitting governments or whatever it is. But privately, Henry would always arrange a private dinner with a small number of young people. And he was always interested to know, what does the next generation or two behind us, what are they thinking about? What are they worried about? And he was very concerned about that. And that's another property that I didn't find in very many people of his stature. The OpenAI thing, you have to understand the evolution. When OpenAI was created, the basic assumption of the people who started it was that you could almost solve this problem with just philanthropic contributions, and hence the not-for-profit structure. The other reason for the not-for-profit structure at the time was, OpenAI was created by some people who were concerned that there really was only one substantive effort toward artificial general intelligence at the time, and that was the DeepMind work in London. And DeepMind had by that time been acquired by Google. And so people were concerned that if the only real effort was essentially at Google, and it was controlled only by that company, that people would be uncomfortable with that. So they said, well, let's have another effort that would go after the same problem. And given that it's thought to be a long-term and difficult problem, it's hard to get venture capital to support it. And because if you think that's only less than 10 years ago, people were saying, well, how far away is AGI? And the betting was, more in the range of 30 to 50 years, not 30 to 50 months. And so they said, okay, well, Elon Musk and a few people, tech people who've been successful, put up some money to fund this thing. And then they did a lot of this investigation. And what emerged, which you hear referenced now as the scaling laws, was ultimately an observation in doing some of the work that they did around Dota for game playing and robot manipulation hands. They were trying a lot of different things. And they basically started to see a pattern that said, if you add more data and more compute, the thing just seems to get smarter. And at some point it crossed a threshold where people realized, wow, this thing is really smart now, or getting really smart really fast. What's making that happen? And it turned out it was just scaling the compute. And so then they started to ask the question, well, how big a scale do you need? And the answer was really big. And so that's what led to ultimately, this sort of relationship that grew between OpenAI and Microsoft, because Microsoft, courtesy of its work in Azure and the cloud and their own AI activities, was building these super scale infrastructures. OpenAI was 60 software people in a room who suddenly had an epiphany that they needed a lot of really big computing. And so that's what allowed those two companies to come together. But you were marrying. Now, why did they want it to be a not-for-profit? They also thought that guaranteed it could never be bought. Because if you were worried that that DeepMind was owned by Google, why would you create the number 2 contender, which would then obviously just be bought by one of the other sort of superpower tech companies somewhere in the world? So the idea was, if we're going to have one that's grounded in trying to be good for humanity, then let's make sure it can't be bought. So making it not for profit sort of guaranteed you couldn't buy it. But that created some problems, very practical problems, when you realized that this thing was going to be a long haul, require a lot of talent and a huge amount of computing and infrastructure. And so they did the deal with Microsoft, which created an acceleration that got them this far. But even with that amount of investment, and now looking at what the demands are, both of training and now broad, diffusion of inference capabilities, it's just a stunning amount of infrastructure that's going to be required. And that includes electrical, power. I mean, we're suddenly saturating power grids in countries just because we're adding all this AI capability. And so OpenAI started realizing it's no longer possible to do this as a philanthropically funded activity. You actually have to make money to pay the bills, to grow the infrastructure, to get to the next level. And so they started trying to do that, but it created this tension that ultimately, unfortunately, manifests as that, you know, that weekend where they fired Sam Altman and then brought him back. And that is very strictly a tension between what people thought their sort of fiduciary responsibility would be as a non-for-profit versus the people who were trying to run the company to succeed in the basic mission of the nonprofit. And so I think, you know, Sam and others have felt, okay, we need to adjust that structure. They still want to make it something where it stands alone and their ultimate goals remain as they were, but they have to deal as they grow with both the need to have and raise more money and operate bigger infrastructures and then, you know, the ability to be governed in a good way on a long-term basis. So that's my own view. I think all from public information there that of what you see happening. And even the announcement that happened today, if you saw it at the White House, you know, it was an announcement primarily between Masa Son and SoftBank and OpenAI and Oracle, along with, you know, participation from NVIDIA, Microsoft, and others, of a $500 billion fund that's being assembled over the next 4 years just to build infrastructure to run OpenAI, you know, capabilities. And so, in a sense, you know, it's now recognized that you need even bigger massing of this capability. And in fact, it was announced at the White House with President Trump today. And I think that's a reflection of the country recognizing that this is a fundamental driver of our economy and capabilities of the future. And therefore, this private activity has now become, you know, a national interest.
Good luck, China.
Thank you so much for sharing your perspective with us tonight. I still cannot decide whether to be hopeful or just simply scared.
Try hope, at least for tonight.
I heard you say that to propagate the AI in the world, you need to have a legal strategy, a technological strategy, a geopolitical strategy. How does religion fit in this? And can religion actually hinder the evolution?
Yeah, good question. I'll give you a synopsis of something that I think is fascinating about my own history with this. About 7 or 8 years ago, a small group of tech people who were involved in OpenAI originally at the beginning decided that there was this question about religion. And we wanted to know, even in these early days, what would the churches think about this? So actually a bunch of us flew to Rome and decided we'll ask the Pope to tell us who in the Catholic Church we could ask about this. And they gave us some people. And so we spent a couple of days in Rome talking to the people in the Catholic Church who, you know, think about these questions. And, you know, these people were really thinking more about traditional technological issues. They hadn't really wrapped their head around the AI thing very much, but it was a constructive conversation. One of the things that was a concern at the time is if you go back, you know, way back in human history, when people saw something that seemed powerful or important and they couldn't explain it, it actually became the basis of a new religion. Now, religions ultimately came under the spell of humans who had their own interests, but these religions have been around for a long time, longer than the sovereign states that we all are part of now. And so one question that lurked then, and you could say may lurk now, is when people start to experience the capacities of these machines to solve problems, you know, cure all our healthcare problems, et cetera, if they're not fully informed or technologically based, you know, will they decide, oh, this is the new God? You know, we need to have an AI religion. And how will that relate to classic religions? So in a sense, it's sort of out there as a question. And I don't think that the churches writ large, have got a real bead on this question as it relates to, their own dogma. And so we'll have to see. Now, what is interesting is if you want to try to create an AI that's going to make decisions about how to align all activities with human values, you can't ignore religion. That, in fact, there's a whole set of rules that many humans, think, are at least important, if not overriding, relative to conventional laws. And there are obviously societies that have blended, religious law and doctrine, with more secular laws. And so, to me, the great thing about the AI is that you can teach it all these laws in all these societies on a separate basis, and it's able to keep them all straight in its head. And that's something humans can't do. And that's why I personally am so bullish on the idea that if we can construct this mechanism using the same technology that we're using to do the interesting applications, that we'll be able to get a handle on making sure that the actions of these machines over time, comport with broadly what humanity thinks is going to be valuable.
And I just have to mention to you, we have a special guest tonight, Reverend Dr. Christopher Bennick, who's in the audience. Chris, raise your hand. One of the leading scholars on AI and religion. He's the minister of First Presbyterian downtown, so you should go talk to Reverend Bennick. We have
Sean,
one more?
We have one more question here, yes.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm really curious, based on your experiences in China, and as someone who's spent a lot of time there and done track 2 conversations, I'm really curious about your optimism when we think about the prevention of spheres of influence in AI, both on the technology and the infrastructure. Think of the nuclear power required to run, the control, the distribution of information. What does that look like in a middle ground where we have conversation but not full unity? And how would you think through that process?
Well, you blended a few different things there. Let me just take like the power question. Turns out another thing I'm involved in with Sam Altman is fusion energy. And I'm super optimistic about that also happening on a much shorter time horizon than conventional wisdom would suggest. And that happens to be a very happy marriage to the AI requirement because it's essentially cheap energy that's zero carbon that we can put anywhere we need it. And therefore, you can essentially think that in the future you'll take all of the AI computing capability off the grid as we know it today. And so a lot of the concern about whether AI is going to be a big driver of, adverse driver of, in the climate change arena, I personally think will be a non-issue. That at the point in time where AI is really reaching, full deployment, that fusion will arrive about the same time, and those things will be paired together. So that also then addresses many aspects of the supply chain questions and others that otherwise become problematic. So if you still thought, I want to do it all with solar, or I want to do it with batteries, or that kind of stuff, well, you don't need any of that if you get the fusion part right. You don't have to have storage. You don't have to have a two-way grid. There's just many, many things that just fundamentally get shifted, not by the AI, but by the roughly simultaneous emergence of fusion. So that's one reason I'm kind of optimistic, despite the tit-for-tat tariff versus export control mantra that exists today. I think that the U.S. does have quite a bit of heavy lifting to do to regain manufacturing capacity to do these things at scale, but that energy and at least the supply chains around the computational infrastructure, the telecom infrastructure, and the energy infrastructure won't be a gating item there. Beyond that, it's a complex environment. The Chinese understand that this is a fundamental game-changing thing. One of the things Henry believed, and I think he shared both with President Xi and certainly we've shared with others, is even if each country was the only country, managing your country through the transition of the emergence of general intelligence will probably become the defining moment, in the next generation of that country and its governance. And so you don't feel the impact of that yet. Maybe just today's action, an announcement at the White House is just a reflection of, even in this country, people starting to come to grips with the importance and the power of the change that's going to be wrought by this emergence. Certainly Henry's message, to Xi and others, and to some extent the things that we focus on in the Track 2 dialogue that Henry set up are around these questions of governance, not all of the random issues that you could, decide to chat about, but the ones that essentially say, both for your own account and for the world, what should we focus on? And, that's going to sort of remain my singular focus in trying to influence the outcome and the direction of these discussions. And, we'll just have to see how it goes. Lots of people can throw monkey wrenches into these discussions, and the world can go wrong in a lot of other ways. But certainly today, if you were handicapping all the countries in the world as to where is it most likely that superintelligence would emerge at scale first, it's going to be the U.S. and China. And despite aspiration, in the UK and France and even the UAE, they're just starting in a real deficit position in many ways. But the China team is fully organized and well-resourced, and there's no lack of understanding about the importance of this among the leadership there. And the question is, does the U.S. really step up to the bar? And do we find, sort of as we did with the Soviets years ago, that at the end of the day, it's in our mutual interest to find some common basis of trust, both between our two countries and ultimately for the world. And we'll wait and see.
Whoa. Well, I'll sleep well tonight. Craig will be here for a few minutes if you have some more questions for him, but that's going to be the last one tonight. Let's give a warm round of applause to Craig Mundie.